Hey everybody, it's the Mad Master here. I'm doing a video today, and this video is about something I was thinking about driving on the way home from grocery shopping today, and that was kind of this trend in the 80s of the media delineating these certain labels for certain bands, and they, especially the mainstream media. So there was a time, this was like the New York Times, I think some other media outlets, that in the late 80s, it wasn't after the Black Album or anything, Metallica were called thinking man's metal. And I'm just like thinking about the back on this, I'm looking back, I'm like, thinking man's metal, okay, I mean, your average Metallica fan from back then, I don't think was a very much of a thinking man. They would rather be a drinking man or a druggy man. Just being honest, that's how things were back then. I'm not criticizing, Now, Justice for All is one of my favorite albums of all time. The first 4 Metallica albums, I think, are absolute, not maybe absolute masterpieces, but pretty close to like kind of the sacred texts of metal, along with like the first 7 Iron Maiden, first 5 Judas Priest, blah 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 blah, right? So this whole labeling of Metallica as thinking man's metal was very flawed from the beginning. Now, first of all, there were bands back then like Queensryche that you couldn't just headbang straight to, but they had, they were heavy, but quote unquote. But I think that fit the label a little bit better than Metallica, even though, I mean, the reason being is because some Hesher could just headbang to Metallica. Yeah, Metallica rules, man. I don't read the lyrics, but, or Iron Maiden for that matter. I mean, you can almost do the same with Iron Maiden. You can almost do the same for many, countless number of metal bands in the 80s were thinking man's metal, progressive metal or early power metal bands, or early, you even had some, maybe Bathory's Blood, Fire, Death made someone like read more about Viking mythology or something. It's like this whole thing led to Metallica believing their own hype, sniffing their own farts, which, never mind. It's like, it's like they got high on their own fumes, after a while, and they were starting to kind of believe their own hype, and, they sold out. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I'm not trying to say like I hate everything from their sellout periods, but yeah, it's just like, it's a really stupid, thing to put on a band, and I think Metallica were the worst culprits of this. So they became more intertwined with the mainstream media and the critics. And the critics always have bands that they salivate over, and then this feeds the music industry cycle, because the music industry gives them more play, or it gives them more press, or even worse, I mean, there's payola involved probably too, so at some steps in that juncture, at that juncture. And this is the whole thing. Yeah, I don't like this calling Metallica thinking man's metal, and then it's like at the expense of all these other bands that were plenty intelligent and plenty intellectual. I think Queensryche, to be fair, I think they were called that by some other media outlets, and maybe after Empire, or maybe it was before that. But the whole notion of thinking man's metal, and I know I'm kind of contradicting what I said earlier, but I'm just saying the majority of people in heavy metal in the 80s, a huge percentage, I'm not going to say percent, majority, maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 60%, were kind of outcasts that, teenage outcasts that maybe experimented with some chemicals a little too much sometimes. I'm just being honest. That's how it was back then. I think that's changed. I think you have this like more middle class, politically correct kind of metal fan now that wasn't in existence back then necessarily, and that's why you have really cringe outlets like Metal Sucks, Metal Cucks I call them, that say all this political, I mean, they go way too far to politically correct, like almost Antifa territory with some of their articles at times. Just like, shut the hell up, you know? And there were always intellectual metal fans or liberal metal fans. It's not a matter of that. In fact, if you go back to the 80s, and I've said this time and time again, you would probably, and look at all the thrash bands and look at all their lyrics and all their ideas, you'd probably come to a conclusion that metal is left wing from just that. So, you know, I'm talking about all the anti-nuclear stuff and environmental stuff like nuclear assault, and, you know, so I don't like these wings or anything like that. Maybe MOD was right wing, or, you know, Agnostic Front, which is not metal, but, you know, whatever. Who cares anyways? Striper were probably right wing too, but who cares about all that stuff? And by the way, speaking of Metallica, James Hetfield's lyrics in the 80s and who he became later don't really jibe up, or, you know, they just don't, there's a contradiction there in my opinion. And then he said, that's why we don't talk about politics. Okay, I seem to think that the whole album Justice for All is very political. Oh shit, I turned on my record player accidentally. That's kind of weird. So this whole notion that, you know, this, I mean, anyways, I don't want to talk about that, but you know, obviously the New York Times was a liberal, mainstream liberal, you know, give it that outlet at the time to some extent. Of course, they had Judith Miller and pushed the war in Iraq and stuff later, but, you know, this whole idea of these media darlings, I think like Behemoth, you know, and even bands, you know, I really like Emperor. There's just like these press darlings, like, oh, this, like, it's like, and then a lot of the times the press will ignore other bands that were just as important or just as innovative and stuff. Because, and I'm not saying Emperor were, but Emperor were really hyped in the mid to late 90s as like this like new thing, black metal and blah blah blah, you know. A lot of controversy too, of course, for obvious reasons, but, you know, it's like there's these bands, and I think Ihsahn himself, okay, Ihsahn, and I do like some of his solo work, especially his first album. I think he's kind of a victim of this hype train too. Like you begin to believe like all the hype, and maybe he's just really does like to dress like a hipster. I don't know. I'm just saying, you know. But I think, and Iron Maiden never had that kind of attention. They do now, but they didn't. They were like, you know, I don't know if they were mocked, but they were just kind of ignored by most people in the press and stuff. They were like, oh yeah, Iron Maiden, except for like the fundamentalist TV preacher types, you know, conservative Christian types, you know, the number of the beast is satanic, you know. But yeah, it's just ridiculous, and I don't like this. Yeah, so I'm just trying to make a statement about this thinking man's metal thing. It's so stupid. It was so stupid. It's more of a story about the past. It was so stupid calling a band thinking man's metal. Oh my god, you know, like, and I guess at the time people thought of metal as like Poison, Motley Crue, you know, and stuff like that, which isn't exactly thinking man's metal. I mean, it's more like get laid and do drugs metal, you know, which there's a time and place for that. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, and that type of subject matter and that type of vibe and attitude. But, you know, there was plenty of metal bands that were thinking man's metal. Voivod, I mean, goddamn, you know. Even King Diamond, at least it's a storytelling thing, you know. It's kind of, I mean, just people are so clueless. But this is what fed a lot of the stuff that happened later, though, in my opinion. You know, like just the whole idea that bands would get this like hype as like being, and Kiss talked about this too, about Music from the Elder and how they kind of wanted that attention, and then once they got it, they kind of retracted it because they're like, we're a rock and roll band. I love the Elder, by the way, but I'm just saying, like, they got kind of trapped in, they don't want it. They kind of took themselves out of that equation, because bands get into that. They get into like their own hype about how they're like seen as these serious artists and they're so intelligent to lyrics, even though there's plenty of other bands that have intelligent lyrics or complicated musical passages, or, you know, I mean, Fate's Warning's Waken the Guardian was already out when Justice for All was out. I mean, maybe that's not as complicated as some of the later Fate's Warning, but still, you know, Watchtower, you know, Coroner, I mean, all sorts of bands were out already. Thinking Man's Metal. Thinking Man. Metallica's Thinking Man's Metal. Oh my God, what a joke. I mean, just to think about how clueless people were back then about, you know, all these bands and metal bands. And Metallica, straight out, probably, you know, maybe the management company, what is it, Cube Prime, maybe like, this is, you know, this, they took their chances with Metallica the most because they thought they would have the biggest chance of success for whatever reason, and other bands got left by the wayside that could have been bigger or as big, you know, but they took that chance. And then this is my theory about the Black Album. I think Lars was going for Hysteria, the album Hysteria by Def Leppard. He wanted to do Metallica's Hysteria because you have that same like mid-pace thing. The production is kind of, they're not similar productions, but they're kind of big sounding with reverb and stuff. This is my theory. Anyways, that's totally another subject. But yeah, Thinking Man's Metal, as if a person in a metal band can't think or can't write lyrics or can't write complicated musical passages or something. Like, it's just dullard rock other than Metallica. What just a fucking joke. Looking back on that today, it's just very cringe. You know, it's just so stupid in it. But like I said, that kind of hype train led to the mediocrity that we got later, because they started to believe their own hype, you know, and they started to have more yes men as a result. So, you know, that's very important. Good press is very important for a band to get big, you know. And it led to things like, I mean, you know, like Ultra Boris on Metal Archives once talked about, he did this infamous review, which I talk about on my podcast, Metal Warriors, Metal Madness, by the way, of Master of Puppets, that he gave 0 stars. And the way that he talked about stuff, it did lead to stuff that was really overblown in the future, which a lot of it I like. Don't get me wrong. I like Opeth, unlike him. There's a lot of stuff that he did not like. It led to, you know, more bands going in this direction, whatever. And Justice for All was a really influential album, too. You listen to even like the Scott Burns, whoever the producer was in Morrisound, that dry, even though I had more bass. By the way, I listened to Justice for All a lot recently, and there is bass on there, on To Live Is to Die. If you listen really closely to Eye of the Beholder, like the beginning, you sort of hear it. There's little stretches of music that you can hear the bass guitar. It's harder to hear for most of the album, but you can hear it. On one, you can't hear it really that well, even though there's like a lot of clean parts, which is weird. But like other parts you can. I don't know what the hell they were doing. I think that Eye of the Beholder riff is so heavy, and then you have like the fade. I don't know what they were doing. I don't know how the hell they did all that stuff. I love the album, don't get me wrong, but I think it could be remixed. But anyways, yeah, that's the whole story of the thing. I just wanted to tell that story about the Thinking Man's Metal idea of the late 80s, like these stupid jerk-off reporters that are not as bad as reporters nowadays, obviously. Like the whole apparatus of the clickbait yellow journalist media is dying out. Even though I wanted to be part of it, I had viralawesome.com, by the way. I had a website. I was trying to get in on that action like 7-8 years ago. I try to be a grifter. No, I'm just kidding. I try to do things. I try sometimes. A little bit. Maybe not enough. Maybe I should have slaved away like 5 hours a day on it or something, writing articles for it. I don't know. But, you know, that whole thing's dying. But, you know, back in the day, there are plenty of people that sniff their own ass and stuff. And like David Frick, like his whole thing. Oh, Metallica's, whoa. When he interviews Metallica, it's like the dumbest shit I've ever heard. I think Metallica want to be seen as like this mainstream rock band, even though they went back to metal for very cynical reasons. they want to be seen as mainstream rock bands. So every other metal band, there's no other metal bands other than Metallica. Like, whoa, what's that? Oh, and then I hate what this is one thing that these fucking journalists say. Well, a lot of other metal bands wouldn't do something like that. How the fuck do you know? Oh, like some little passage on some mediocre modern Metallica song, you know, like, oh, a lot of metal bands don't do that. Half the fucking prog metal bands probably do something like that, whatever he's talking about. I'm not giving a specific example, but just these journalist jackasses like him. I don't hate everything David Fricke has done, but I'm just saying, like, when he interviews Metallica, it's just the dumbest, most naive bullshit that you could ever hear from a journalist. Anyways, I gotta stop because it's getting to be 15 minutes, but that's about all.